The surgical tent at Station 105, Chelston Airfield, was a world of stark contrasts. The air, thick with the coppery scent of blood, and the sharp tang of antiseptic, was cold enough to see one's breath. Yet the surgeons worked in a focused, sweating intensity under the electric lights. It was October 1942, and another B-17 had limped back from across the channel. Its human cargo of pain delivered to Colonel Malcolm Cummings, Gros Domain. He was bent over the operating table, his hands, encased in thin rubber gloves, moving with a precise, wary rhythm. The young man on the table was a navigator, barely 20. The flak burst had sent a spray of metal through the thin skin of his bomber, and several jagged pieces had found a home in his chest. Gros' mind, trained to observe and categorize, noted the details automatically. The wounds were not the clean, puncturing holes of a machine gun bullet. These were ragged, tearing lacerations. The trajectory was low velocity. The fragments had tumbled through the air, losing most of their energy before they ripped through the young man's leather jacket and into his body. The jacket might as well have been tissue paper. As his fingers worked to delicately extract a twisted piece of German steel from near the boy's lung, Gros could hear the distant, laboured cough of another fortress landing. Then the approaching wail of more ambulances. The mathematics of it all were becoming a crushing, unbearable equation. Day after day, the same story. Nearly 70% of the casualties streaming into his field hospital shared this same wound profile. Not from the high-velocity rounds of Foch, Wolfs or Messerschmitts, but from these slower, tumbling pieces of shrapnel, fragments of anti-aircraft shells that exploded in black puffs of death at 20,000 feet, or pieces of the aircraft itself, shredded by the concussions and turned into deadly projectiles inside the cramped fuselages. This navigator would live. Gros had seen worse, and the damage, while serious, was not catastrophic. But others that day would not be so lucky. As he stepped back from the table, allowing his assistants to close up, a profound and grim certainty settled over him. These wounds, these specific, common life, threatening injuries, were preventable. The knowledge, the very technology to prevent them, had existed for centuries. It was a matter of simple physics and basic materials. Someone just needed to ask the right question in the right place. Wiping his brow with his forearm, Colonel Gros made a decision. He would be that someone. Within months, that question would save the first of what would eventually become thousands of lives. The collapse of the myth of the unprotected bomber crew had begun months earlier on a seemingly successful mission. August 17, 1942. The 97th Bomb Group launched the first American heavy bomber mission of the war. 18 B-17 flying fortresses crossed the English Channel to attack the marshalling yards at Rouen, Sotteville in occupied France. Major Paul Tibbets led 12 bombers against the primary target while 6 others flew a diversion. All aircraft returned safely. The opposition near the French coast had been light, a gentle introduction to the air war over Europe. It was a deceptive con. As the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into German, controlled territory through the autumn and winter of 1942, the casualty statistics began to tell a different, far grimmer story, one that contradicted every optimistic assumption about the viability of daylight precision bombing. The first comprehensive analysis of 8th Air Force combat casualties, compiled in October 1942, was a shock to military planners. Medical officers had painstakingly gathered data from every wounded airman who passed through the British hospital system. The numbers revealed a pattern no one had fully anticipated. The primary threat wasn't German fighter aircraft, it was Flak. The analysis showed, with chilling clarity, that approximately 70% of all bomber crew wounds resulted from relatively low velocity projectiles. These were not bullets, but fragments from exploding anti-aircraft shells and shards of the bomber's own structure, torn loose by the violent energy of a nearby flak burst. The flak environment over occupied Europe was a hellish creation, unlike anything American air planners had prepared for. The Germans had developed and refined their anti-aircraft batteries, the Flugabwehrkanonen or Flak, through years of combat. By late 1942, the Luftwaffe had positioned thousands of these guns around every strategic target. The standard 80 Flak gun could fire a shell to altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet. Each shell carried a time delay fuse, designed to detonate at a predetermined altitude, transforming its casing into a cloud of hundreds of razor-sharp metal fragments, scything through the air at lethal velocities. Colonel Groh, a surgeon, understood the medical implications immediately. The data was irrefutable. Torso wounds constituted the overwhelming majority of fatal injuries. Chest wounds alone accounted for 36% of fatalities among unarmored crews. Abdominal wounds added another 39%. Combined, wounds to the body's core, the heart, lungs, liver, spleen, represented 75% of all deaths. The mathematics were brutally straightforward: protect the torso, and you dramatically reduce fatalities. But the solution was not obvious. The United States Army Air Forces had no body armor program in 1942. The very concept of personal armor had been relegated to the history books after World War I, where experiments with heavy steel vests proved too cumbersome for infantrymen who needed mobility above all else. Aviation warfare, however, presented a completely different set of parameters. Bomber crews were already encumbered. They wore heavy flying suits, dragged oxygen hoses, were harnessed to parachutes. They operated in confined spaces where the ability to dodge and weave was non-existent. Most critically, they faced a specific threat profile dominated by these slower, moving fragments, not high-velocity bullets. Groh's surgical training gave him an insight the tacticians and planners lacked. He understood wound ballistics. A fragment from a flak shell, after traveling 200 yards from the explosion point to the aircraft, had lost most of its initial velocity. Such a projectile, traveling at perhaps 500 to 1,000 feet per second, could be stopped by a relatively thin plate of steel. The same principle applied to fragments of aircraft aluminum and steel torn loose by explosions. These were not armor-piercing bullets traveling at 3,000 feet per second. These were tumbling, spent pieces of metal that had already expended much of their kinetic energy. They were, in essence, a medieval threat in a modern battlefield. In October 1942, armed with his data and his conviction, Groh submitted a formal proposal to 8th Air Force headquarters. He requested authorization to develop personal armor for bomber crews. The proposal cited the damning casualty analysis and included his own preliminary sketches of a vest that would incorporate overlapping steel plates sewn into a fabric carrier. The design was consciously inspired by history, specifically medieval brigandine armor, which used the same principle of small, overlapping plates to provide flexibility while maintaining protection. The initial response was a wall of skepticism. Weight was the immediate and loudest objection. Bomber crews already carried nearly 40 pounds of equipment. Adding another 20+ pounds of steel seemed impractical, a burden that could impair their ability to perform their duties or quickly escape a crippled aircraft. There were concerns about cost, about production capacity in the midst of a total war, and a simple, almost fatalistic belief among some officers that crews would simply refuse to wear the cumbersome gear in combat. Some argued, with a certain logic, that the resources would be better spent on improving fighter escort capability. But Groh persisted. He was a doctor, and he had seen the evidence on his operating table. He proposed a simple, empirical solution, a limited field test. Produce a small quantity of the armor vests. Issue them to volunteer crews. Then, track the casualty statistics and compare them to the unarmored crews. Let the data speak for itself. Reluctantly, headquarters authorized the experiment, but with one critical condition. The armor had to be developed quickly and manufactured outside the normal, clogged military supply channels. The Army Air Forces simply didn't have the capacity. This sent Grow to the British. The Royal Air Force had, in fact, experimented with body armor for their own bomber crews, but had encountered insurmountable obstacles. British bombers, particularly the Avro Lancaster, were notoriously cramped. The confined spaces made the addition of any bulky armor utterly unworkable. The RAF experiments had been abandoned by late 1942. However, American bombers, the B-17 and B-24, while far from spacious, offered slightly more interior room. What hadn't worked for the RAF might just work for the Americans. The British military liaison connected Grow with the Wilkinson Sword Company, a firm with a curiously appropriate pedigree. Founded in 1772, Wilkinson had built its reputation on manufacturing swords, bayonets, and later, the world's finest razors. But the company maintained a deep expertise in metallurgy and had a long, if sporadic, history with armor work, dating back to the Victorian era when they produced experimental bulletproof vests for officers in colonial conflicts. During World War I, they had manufactured body armor, though its weight made it unpopular in the trenches. Now, in World War II, the company had shifted most of its production to aircraft components, like fire suppression systems, but they retained the technical knowledge and the skilled craftsmen to work with armor plate. Grow travelled to Wilkinson's facility in October 1942, his preliminary designs and medical data in hand. The collaboration that followed was an unusual partnership between military medicine and civilian manufacturing. Grow brought his understanding of wound ballistics and human anatomy. Wilkinson contributed its expertise in metalwork and production engineering. Together, they refined the design through multiple iterations, each one a careful balancing act between protection, weight, and flexibility. The final design consisted of 3 separate pieces. The main vest, covering the torso front and back, was the core component. A separate apron piece protected the lower abdomen and groin. An additional, configurable piece could be added to protect specific crew positions, like the ball turret gunner, who faced unique threat angles from below. Each section was made up of 2-inch square plates of manganese steel, each plate roughly 1 millimeter thick. These plates were overlapped like scales and sewn into pockets within a heavy canvas outer shell, which was backed with a soft cotton lining for comfort. The critical innovation was the selection of manganese steel. This specific alloy provided just the right hardness to stop or deflect reduced velocity fragments while remaining thin enough to keep the overall weight manageable. Each individual steel square weighed only a few ounces, but collectively, they created a flexible shield for the torso's vital organs. The complete vest and apron combination weighed approximately 22 pounds, substantial, but not prohibitive given the stakes. Crucially, the design included a quick release mechanism, a series of colored cords and fasteners. A sharp pull on the red rip cord would instantly jettison the entire armor system, addressing the very real concern about crews needing to bail out of a burning aircraft in seconds. By early 1943, Wilkinson Sword had produced the first prototype armor suits for testing. The field tests began in March, with crews from a few bomb groups receiving the British manufactured vests. The results were almost immediate and profoundly promising. Wounded crew members began appearing at field hospitals, still wearing their damaged armor. Medical officers would examine the vests and find flak fragments embedded in the steel plates. stopped dead before they could penetrate through to the wearer's body. The evidence was right there, in the dented metal. The fragments had lost enough energy travelling from the flak, burst to the aircraft that this thin manganese steel was sufficient to defeat them. By the spring of 1943, demand for the armour was beginning to outstrip the British production capacity. Word had spread through the 8th Air Force bases across eastern England. The flak suit was becoming a coveted piece of gear. But Wilkinson Sword's facilities were already committed to other vital war production. They could only produce about 100 armour suits per month. A drop in the bucket compared to the thousands needed to equip the rapidly expanding bomber fleet. In the summer of 1943, Colonel Grow began the work of shifting production to the United States. The War Department, now convinced by the field data, authorized immediate domestic production. The contract process that followed was one of the war's most unusual stories of collaboration. It involved not just military arsenals and industrial manufacturers, but also, improbably, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. The museum's armor workshop, staffed by medieval armor experts and skilled craftsmen, became the primary design research facility. These specialists, whose normal work involved restoring priceless historical artifacts, now studied suits of armor from the museum's collection, particularly 15th century brigandines, and adapted their timeless principles to modern materials and manufacturing techniques. Stephen V. Grandsay, the curator of the Metropolitan Museum's Arms and Armor Department, led this extraordinary research effort. He would later describe the process in a 1945 article in the Metropolitan Museum of Art Bulletin. The design of Armor Vest M6, which is the latest standardized flyer's armor, is based on one of the museum's brigandines, dating from about 1400. The suits of armor in the exhibition halls are constantly studied for suggestions, and no type which seems to hold the slightest promise of adaptation is overlooked. Heavy armor for the military sport of jousting, lighter battle armor, shirts of mail-scale armor, and the quilted jackets of Renaissance days have all been carefully examined. American production began in mid-1943 with multiple facilities producing variations of the core design. The standardized version, the M1 vest, used nylon fabric instead of canvas for the outer shell, a modification that improved water resistance and durability. The cotton backing was retained for comfort. The steel plates remained the same specification, developed with Wilkinson Sword. Production rapidly scaled up as manufacturers across the United States began receiving contracts. On October 5, 1943, the M1 Flyer's vest was officially adopted as standard equipment for all 8th Air Force bomber crews. The authorization memo specified that every combat crew member would be issued armor appropriate to their position. This decision triggered a massive logistical undertaking. The 8th Air Force was in a period of explosive growth. New bomb groups were arriving in England almost monthly. Each group required hundreds of armor suits. The M1 vest itself weighed 17 pounds and 6 ounces, slightly lighter than the British Wilkinson model, due to improvements in plate arrangement and fabric selection. The armor was modular. Pilots and co-pilots, who sat in armored seats that offered some protection from below, received a modified M2 vest with less coverage in the back. Ball turret gunners, folded into the fetal position in their tiny, exposed spheres beneath the aircraft, received the M3 apron designed for their unique confines. Waist gunners, who stood at open windows, got the M4 apron optimized for their standing position. Bombardiers, navigators, and other seated personnel received the M5 groin armor to supplement the main vest. This modularity allowed each crew member to configure their protection based on their specific threat exposure and the physical constraints of their duty station. The initial resistance from crews, The fear of being weighed down evaporated almost overnight once they experienced the armor in combat. It became known simply as the flak jacket, and it was donned with the same routine as a parachute. It was a tangible piece of security, a psychological shield as much as a physical one. By early 1944, the armor program had expanded to include additional protective equipment. The M3 helmet, developed specifically for bomber crews and later named the Grow helmet, after its inventor, provided far better shrapnel protection than the standard infantry helmet. It consisted of overlapping strips of manganese steel riveted over a leather flying helmet base, creating a helmet that could stop fragments that would easily penetrate other designs. The data continued to pile up, overwhelmingly in the armor's favor. A comprehensive study conducted by 8th Air Force medical officers examined 117 battle casualties from heavy bombardment groups. The results were staggering. Among crews not wearing body armor, fatalities from chest wounds were 36% and from abdominal wounds 39%. Among armored crews, these numbers plummeted to 8% and 7% respectively. This represented a 77.1% reduction in fatal thoracic wounds and an 82.1% reduction in fatal abdominal wounds. Overall, the study showed a 58% reduction in the number of individuals wounded and a 60% reduction in the total number of wounds sustained after the introduction of armor. The armor was not a magic talisman. It could not prevent all deaths. Head wounds from larger fragments or direct bullet hits remained lethal. Limb wounds continued to cause serious casualties. A fragment striking at an extreme angle could sometimes slip through the gaps between plates. A direct hit from a larger caliber projectile could still punch through the thin steel. But the armor succeeded magnificently at its primary mission. It stopped the majority of the slower, moving fragments that constituted the single greatest threat to bomber crews. The brutal effectiveness of the armor was put to the ultimate test on October 14, 1943, a day that would become known as Black Thursday. The second raid on the Ball, bearing factories at Schweinfurt, saw 291 B-17s dispatched. The result was a catastrophe. 60 bombers were shot down, 17 more were damaged beyond repair, and 121 returned with significant battle damage. The losses represented over 20% of the attacking force. It was a devastating blow. Yet, amidst the carnage, medical officers examining the returning crews found countless examples of the flak vests, preventing even more appalling casualties. Crew members displayed vests with multiple fragments embedded in the steel plates. Without the armor, the death toll on that single dark day would have been even more unimaginable. The armor could not overcome the fundamental tactical challenge of unescorted daylight bombing in 1943, but it had proven its worth in the fires of hell. The true turning point for bomber operations came not from armor alone, but from its synergy with another innovation, the long-range fighter escort. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang, with fuel tanks that allowed it to escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back, changed the equation. The Mustangs could engage German interceptors before they could reach the bomber boxes. The combination of better fighter cover and armor created a powerful synergy that dramatically improved survival rates by the spring of 1944. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the 8th Air Force was a mature, overwhelming force. Thousands of aircraft conducted precision strikes against French transportation networks and German coastal defenses. The armor program had equipped virtually every bomber crew. The production hurdles had been overcome. By war's end, the numbers were staggering. 338 780 M1 vests and 95 919 M2 vests had been produced. One of the most remarkable aspects of the entire program was its speed. From Colonel Groh's initial analysis and proposal, in October 1942 to full-scale production and distribution by late 1943 was a span of just 1 year. A breathtakingly fast timeline for a major military innovation that required new design, testing, contractor selection, production scaling, and complex distribution logistics. The program also stood as a testament to effective Allied cooperation. The British provided the initial production capacity and crucial metallurgical expertise through Wilkinson Sword. The UK supplied 9 600 flak jackets to the USAF under reverse lend-lease. American manufacturers then scaled up production using the British designs as a foundation, while the Metropolitan Museum of Art provided the design research that refined and improved the American versions. It was a collaboration that crossed national and organizational boundaries in ways that were uncommon even in the cooperative spirit of wartime. Colonel Malcolm Grow continued his innovations throughout the war. Beyond body armor, he developed improved oxygen systems to reduce hypoxia at high altitudes. He pioneered the concept of combat rest homes, where stress-fatigued crews could recover between missions. He instituted psychiatric screening and support programs that reduced breakdowns from combat fatigue. His approach to crew health was holistic, addressing both the physical and mental challenges of aerial warfare simultaneously. His contributions did not go unrecognized. In July 1943, he was awarded the Legion of Merit for developing body armor. The citation noted that his study of wounds showed nearly 70% were caused by missiles of relatively low velocity, and that he had led the way in developing light body armor and a steel helmet that saved many lives and materially improved combat crew morale. In May 1944, he received the Distinguished Service Medal for a host of other innovations, including a device to protect gunners from wind blast, electrically heated clothing, gloves, boots, hand warmers, casualty bags for the wounded, and wind and fire-resistant face and neck protectors. His work directly led to a decrease in frostbite cases and an increase in flight efficiency. After the war, Grow's career continued its ascent. He was appointed acting air surgeon for the Army Air Forces in 1945 and air surgeon in 1946. When the United States Air Force became an independent service in 1947, the medical service initially remained with the Army. But on July 1, 1949, Malcolm Cummings Grow was appointed as the first Surgeon General of the United States Air Force, serving until his retirement on November 30, 1949. He retired with the rank of Major General. He died on October 20, 1960, at the age of 72, having lived to see the full, life-saving impact of the program he had initiated from a surgeon's tent in 1942. The legacy of his work extended far beyond World War II. The lessons learned from the Flak vest program directly influenced the development of body armor for ground troops in Korea. The M1952 vest used ballistic nylon instead of steel plates but followed the same modular design principles. Vietnam-era flak jackets incorporated improved materials but retained the basic concept of flexible armor, providing protection against fragments. Modern body armor, with its advanced ceramic plates and Kevlar fabric, represents the pinnacle of technological advancement. But it follows the same fundamental approach that Colonel Grow pioneered: identify the most common threat and design practical, wearable protection against it. Every police officer wearing a bulletproof vest, every soldier equipped with interceptor body armor, every person whose life has been saved by flexible armor technology owes a debt to the Flak vest program of World War II. The story contains no dramatic battlefield heroics in the traditional sense. There are no last stands or single-handed victories against impossible odds. Instead, it is a story of careful observation, relentless data analysis, creative problem solving, and sheer bureaucratic persistence. Colonel Grow saw a pattern in the suffering he treated every day. He connected that pattern to a solution drawn from the distant past. He collaborated with a sword company and a museum to bring that solution to life. He advocated, cajoled, and proved his case until the evidence was undeniable. The program demonstrated a vital principle. That technology can save lives even in the most lethal environments if the right problems are identified and addressed systematically. Protection does not require perfect invulnerability. It requires adequate protection against the most common threats to reduce casualties to manageable levels. The M1 flyer's vest couldn't stop everything, but it didn't need to. It needed to stop most fragments, most of the time. And that is exactly what it did. The combined bomber offensive over Europe exacted a terrible toll. By war's end, the 8th and 15th Air Forces together suffered over 27,000 killed in action and another 9,000 wounded. RAF Bomber Command lost over 55,000 men killed, with approximately 18,000 wounded. These staggering numbers underscore the profound importance of any measure that could improve survival rates. Body armor represented one of the most effective life-saving initiatives of the entire air war, with documented casualty reductions of 60% overall and over 77% for fatal torso wounds. The bomber crews who flew through the Flak, filled skies over Germany in 1944, had a dramatically better chance of surviving their tour and returning home than those who flew the same missions in 1942. Better tactics helped. Improved tactics helped. But body armor helped more than most people realized, because it addressed the most common cause of casualties. The Malcolm Grow Medical Center at Andrews Air Force Base stands as a permanent memorial to his contributions, ensuring that future generations of Air Force medical personnel remember the surgeon who looked at a pattern of wounds and saw not an inevitability of war, but a solvable problem. His work established a legacy that continues to protect lives today. It is a testament to the power of one determined individual, armed with data, dedication, and an unwavering commitment to those who serve, to alter the course of history and save thousands of lives in the process. The mathematics of aerial warfare were forever changed in that cold surgical tent in October 1942, not by a weapon, but by a shield.